Hello, everyone. This is your masked stranger, Max Orr, Executive Director of Carolina Public Humanities. Welcome you to today's Humanities in Action Talk, a gig economy insurgency. It's a real pleasure to invite you. Let me just adjust my mask because of the COVID realities. Invite you to today's Humanities in Action event. It is our penultimate Humanities in Action event. I'll mention what we have coming up next week in just a moment. If you don't know who we are and what we do, we are the public outreach arm for the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's our job to take the great faculty and scholarship at Carolina and share them with as many communities throughout the state as we can. And of course, we do that with these great public programs here at Flyleaf Books. Many of you come for these live in the real world, if you will. And of course, our weekend seminars and great books reading groups, back in the pre-COVID days, cinema schools, language lunches, all sorts of wonderful ways that we can reach the public with great scholarship. I want to let you know about two other features of our program that aren't quite as obvious for the general public, and that is our extensive K-12 workshops. We work through our subsidiary, Carolina K-12, and what we're able to do with that is to bring teachers from all around the state to convene and work with, again, some of the best scholarship and faculty available to help them make their classrooms full of this, have an opportunity to engage with this scholarship. We also have a very extensive community college outreach program, our state outreach program, that is linking up with community colleges and libraries, and again, bringing such great scholarship to all of the communities of North Carolina. So we want to make sure you're aware of all of those. You can go to humanities.unc.edu to see what we do and who we are. And we also want to mention to you that we accept your donations. We would love any help you have, especially for those programs for K-12 teachers and community colleges. These are programs we don't charge anything for, and they help us, again, reach these communities that don't have access right now to this scholarship. So I think Paul is putting in some links there. If you're interested in donating to Carolina Public Humanities, we're very grateful for donations of any size, and of course, all are tax deductible. Before we begin, we have a few people to thank. I want to thank, of course, our great friends at the North Carolina Honor Society who have been underwriting our K-12 program, especially our Teaching Hard History workshops. We're very grateful for their support. We're also grateful for the support of the Cotton Merca Group at Morgan Stanley, who also are supporting in particular our K-12 workshops. Carolina Meadows, a retirement community in Chapel Hill, who helps us with both our public-facing programs and our teacher workshops. And our great partner, the General Alumni Association, with whom we put on, promote, and publicize all sorts of great programs. So thank you to all of our institutions that we ally with and that help us fulfill our mission. I also want a big shout out to Flyleaf Books. As I mentioned, Flyleaf Books is our home away from home. Normally we have our great books reading groups right in this very room, which if you were to see it, looks nothing like you might remember it. We have a lot of cameras and a lot of other stuff here, but Flyleaf has been so very gracious in allowing us to continue to use this space as a studio so that we can continue to reach you. So please come on by Flyleaf Books. They're open for browsing, and this is where you should be getting your books. It's a true sign of civilization to have an independent, fully functioning bookstore. Okay, I want to mention a few programs coming up. I mentioned this is the penultimate program. We're very excited to mention that our final program will be next Wednesday in the Political Science Department. We're bringing in Ashley Anderson, who will be talking about the new American populocracy. That's a word I haven't said before. How the rise of populist attitudes threaten our democracy. This is a Humanities in Action program that we added after we had put together the series, so it might not be on your radar. So we want you to, again, you can go to humanities.unc.edu to sign up for that. If you have bought a season pass, come on by. You already have access to that talk. So let's get right to it and talk about today's program. We are very excited to welcome Margaret Foster as a postdoctoral fellow in political science. Dr. Foster is a product of the University of Pennsylvania, did some studying up in McGill University where she received her master's degree, and finished up at Duke University, which I'm sure you've all heard of, right over here in Durham, our friendly school, rivals in sports but friends in academics. Dr. Foster studies the organization, leadership, recruitment, and social function of extremist groups, in particular looking at some of the groups that might be on your radar from all of the troubles in the Middle East over the last 20 years. This is a talk that's a little different from the other talks we have, but it's a nice reminder that for all that we have been so inwardly focused on American politics and on our own particular situation here. The world is going on out there, and many of the issues that plagued us before COVID struck are still out there. So this is in some ways a hopeful talk that we'll be able to start turning our attention to other problems. But I hate to introduce it as introducing us to other problems. Let's just introduce Margaret Foster. Please take it away.
Thank you very much for that extremely generous introduction. I'm here to talk to you about potentially a new perspective on militant groups and their human resources, what I'm calling the gig economy insurgency. And so as an outline of where we'll be going for the next hour or so, in the beginning I'm going to present some context. How do political scientists and often people who are interested in following news of conflicts around the world, how do they tend to think about militant groups? And then I'm going to introduce a new perspective, although I've already given that away in the gig economy insurgency title, provide some examples, walk through some of the second order effects of this increasingly important way of structuring militant groups. I'll wrap it up, and then we'll talk a little bit about broader implications and what that might have to bring to bear on increasing experiences of right-wing militancy or extremism as it's spreading throughout the world beyond jihadi conflict in the Middle East. And then I hope we'll have a lot of time for question and answer after the lecture. So in the context, who are the subjects of this talk? I'm going to largely be talking about militant groups, usually sub-state militant groups in the Middle East. These are armed organizations that are often trying to supplant the state, that are explicitly trying to seize power or land, often trying to take over the state apparatus to implement maybe a revolutionary perspective, or even to just take over the state apparatus in order to effectuate their own benefits or advantage their own organizations and their own communities. The names that I'll use are alternatively militant groups. I'm also talking about often pulling examples from the jihadi organizations. And so sometimes I'll use the word extremist groups. In that case, it's a little bit of a shorthand for militant extremist organizations, but I'll sometimes say extremism as a way to break up just using the word militant for the next hour straight. Where are they located? Many of the examples that I'll be talking about are in the Middle East, in the southern Mediterranean, across the Levant, through Iraq, into Afghanistan. But I hope that some of the references and some of the lessons that we can take apply around the world and might shed a little bit of light on the development of domestic extremist groups and how I think that there's some really interesting sort of suggestions about how organizations can begin and take steps that at every individual point are very rational and help them outcompete other militant organizations or extremist organizations, but ultimately lead them down a very different trajectory than they initially planned. And I hope that this will speak to the US context at the end. So talking about militant human resources, why is this topic interesting? This may not be what you think about when you think about militant organizations generally. One of the things that's really interesting, though, is that writ large, we know that human resources in militant groups is really difficult. By definition, these are armed organizations that are trying to take over the state, which means that the state is their enemy. And states are usually not very tolerant of armed organizations that are trying to usurp the state's power and resources and control. And so the state is therefore usually out to get you. But among the sort of problem of trying to take over the state and therefore the state being out to get you, there's this embedded issue in which tighter oversight means more vulnerability. In the literature, this is called the security control trade-off. And what that means is that if you are more controlled as a leader, if you spend more time auditing your followers, if you spend more time making sure that they do what it is that you want them to do, that allows the state more windows of opportunity to see how your organization is structured and what the chain of commands are and being able to find you as a militant leader. And so this makes it actually extremely difficult to coordinate operations, especially if you have any kind of geographic spread in which you're trying to operate. And as an academic, that makes it very interesting for me. And so why am I talking to you about militant groups? So before I started at Duke and after my training at UPenn and McGill, I worked for about 10 years as an analyst at a DC-based think tank in which the bulk of my job was to read online communications from online extremists, often jihadi militants, sometimes right-wing extremists. And after years and years and years of reading online communications and strategy documents, one of the things that really emerged is that jihadi groups talk a lot about how difficult it is to be a jihadi group and how difficult it is to be a credible militant organization. And so what do we learn? We learn about different ways of thinking about militant groups beyond the established perspectives. So how do scholars, and often people who are generally interested in this topic, tend to think about militant organizations? They usually think about secrecy. One-way entry, they think about tight social and ideological bounds, and they think about extreme commitment and insularity. In short, people tend to think about militant groups as similar to their close cousins, as similar to gangs, as similar to other kinds of extremist groups like, you might say, cult, or other groups that are in opposition to the state and therefore try to keep themselves very insular to protect themselves against infiltration. And so one of the ways that existing research follows this insular framing. Lines of inquiry into militant HR include things about the recruitment policies and goals. It includes socialization and discipline. It includes organizational design and structure. It tends to look at militant organizations and group members of militant groups. And from this, there are a lot of things that we learn. We have learned about how you bring in people into a group has a lot of influence. We've learned that there's this really sort of subtle effect of how people recruit. So if you recruit operatives and foot soldiers based on offering them physical rewards versus an ideological payoff, what we've learned is that that has a tendency to produce second-order effects of casualties against civilians. On a similar note, we've learned that casualties against civilians and atrocities can be an internal organizational structure that is designed to create tighter bonds. As a sort of blatant plug of my own work, we have learned why sometimes you see militant, higher level commanders disappear. Sometimes they get killed if they get purged from groups. And then very occasionally you see essentially press releases announcing why someone has been fired that will occasionally even make it into places like the New York Times. And that's a really wide angle and has a lot of tells us a lot about how groups work internally with their own members and with their own HR. But shares a lot of this perspective of organizations as concentrated insular networks of people that are definitively within. However, there's a counterpoint. And if you look at some of discussions and readings and literature about the more general conflict environment, you can see a much more fuzzy boundary. So there's another form of militant work that's described in a lot of analysis and reporting. So for example, this first quote is by a NATO analyst looking at Afghanistan and talking about how intractable the problem of improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, has been. And so what they say is that, in Afghanistan, it's really hard to eradicate IEDs because there's this entire network of low-level insurgents and hired help that carry out the really difficult parts of doing IED attacks. They do the emplacing, they do the triggering, and not only is it hard to track all of these individuals that are not necessarily tightly linked to the Taliban themselves, but they do it for small amounts of money. And so therefore, trying to cut militant funding resources is effective writ large, but doesn't have the kind of very granular effect you might want to see by reducing the resources that militant groups have at their hand, because the amounts of money are really small, especially in the context of the amount of money of an occupation, of a militancy, of like a state military. And then 5 years later, looking at the rise of ISIS from the Sunni Iraqi insurgency through Al-Qaeda in Iraq, through the Islamic State of Iraq, and then through Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, you have two sort of the foremost journalists of the history of ISIS talking about the rise of the Sunni insurgency in Iraq in the early 2000s again. And here they're saying that locals similarly were being hired to carry out operations. And again, for very small amounts of money, $50 a pop. And then you can see the same perspective that's been articulated by journalists and analysts in militants themselves. So as the Syrian civil war became active in 2011, there was several years in which there was this explosion of social media posts by fighters in the conflict. by fighters, by civilians, by journalists, documenting this extremely complicated, very bloody, very tragic conflict in literally real time. And in this large genre online, there was a subgenre that had individuals claiming to be foreign fighters, often writing and speaking in English, who were documenting their, frankly, their adventures in Syria. They were often doing this in order to attract more recruits or more money or more support. Sometimes they seemed to be doing it for their own aggrandization. But they also shared what it was like. And in addition to very high profile things like Twitter pages, they would have these sort of online fan accounts on platforms like ask.fm, where their followers could pose questions about what their life was like. And so you have militants in these contexts talking about what they're doing and how their life is organized. And a lot of them describe what they called independent groups or independent brigades. So one who used the name Dread Muslim a lot, he talked about how he's in an independent brigade because one is safer. We keep away from the infighting. In this case, infighting is a reference to the fratricidal conflict between Sunni insurgencies to dominate the anti-Bashar al-Assad resistance. And then a second very high-profile Sunni militant claiming to be a Sunni person online, claiming to be a Sunni militant in Syria. You have to be careful about how you phrase these because anyone can post anything online. He again is presenting himself as a fighter, quite credibly because he has thousands of posts about what he's doing in Syria. And he says again that he's with an independent group. What he says is that he's not part of ISIS, he's not part of the Nusra Front, but he and his group work with a lot of different organizations in the general Sunni resistance in Syria. And so what are these quotes telling us? Is that they're telling us that there's this constellation of informal arrangements that connect to groups without necessarily being attached to the groups. And then so I went looking for this in my documents and in primary sources that I have over the years, in memoirs, of which there's a lot, in analysis, in newspaper coverage and articles. And you actually, in the entire arc of the transnational jihadi conflict cycle, it's very evident. And it's really interestingly consistent across these 30 years. So we have this in evidence in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And this would be the sort of Afghan-Arab conflict against the Soviet Union, or this would be the Afghan conflict against the Soviet Union that brought in Afghan Arabs as foreign fighters. And then among the Afghan Arabs themselves, there were a lot of informal arrangements among them and then between the Afghan militants at the time. And if anyone is interested in the Q&A, there's some really interesting stuff here about how analysts' misunderstanding of the flexibility and fluidity of these arrangements led to a lot of implications for understanding of what happened with 9/11 and where the origin of Al-Qaeda came from. That is sort of outside of the scope, but we can talk about in Q&A. And then after Afghanistan stops being a major hotspot for the international transnational jihadi conflict sphere, there's memoirs of being foreign fighters in Bosnia in the 90s, in which it is a much more structured conflict. But even then, there were things called sort of the walkers, who would create themselves as informal brigades that would then travel between conflict and conflict and take part in them as there was sort of opportunities for what's called work. However, where this really takes off is Iraq in the 2000s and Afghanistan in 2000s. After the U.S. occupation creates these large Sunni insurgencies, there is just an enormous variation of ways in which there are official militant groups, there's subcontracted operations, there's bounties. It's a huge diversity of ways of having human resources. And then this is carried through into Syria in the 2000s, in which the conflict became extremely volatile, especially because of these independent brigades. Although in the subsequent years since, there's been sort of a recrystallization around groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, its successor, trying to reconsolidate power among groups with very specific membership and obligations. And so what I did in looking through research on my own archives, I classified these in the idea of how this diversity shows up. where you have trainers, bounty hunters, logistics, commission-based operatives, independent brigades, explosives manufacturers. And this is all very apparent in the records, but not necessarily how academics have tended to think about militant groups, with the exception of subcontracted logistics, because there's a very large literature looking at how militant groups often work with underground criminal networks in trying to use their smuggling networks or resources and logistics networks. And so from there, there's the question of how do we organize these threads, right? So I've just thrown a lot of places, a lot of times, a lot of quotes, and a lot of different job descriptions at you very quickly. But can we make it into something that is a little more comprehensible and a little more structured and organized? And from here, I'm going to introduce two ideas, actually 4 ideas, but 2 main ones. And that there's a very distinctive organization based on contracts and how relationships between the groups that commission operations and the people that they commission them from are, and how they're paid. In order to not have to say groups that commission operations and those that do them, I'm going to take another step back and introduce a little bit of terminology that is extremely central to a lot of the ways in which political science and economists think about organizations, and that's principals and agents. And for anyone who's done any kind of management, this will be very familiar. The idea is that principals are entities or groups or units that hire others. They delegate work. They do this to extend their in-house capabilities or even to extend their own personal capabilities. You can expand what you can accomplish by having employees who are your agents, who are the people, the unit, the groups that enter into the contract with another entity, and that they're compensated for services rendered. And now this creates these very complicated and often quite subtle questions about how does the principal incentivize the agent, right? So again, anyone who's done any kind of management knows that the principal would like to tell the agent what to do, and they would like the agent to carry that out in the same way that the principal would do it if the principal had time and the skills and the resources. The agent, on the other hand, usually has their own agenda, and they are therefore wanting to carry out what they can do that the principal has demanded up until the limit of where the principal is going to stop paying attention. And so then you have these questions about how do principals design mechanisms and verification structures in order to ensure that the agent does what the principal wants, which is very complicated and often quite difficult in the best situation. But thinking back to the early slide where I was talking about the security control trade-off is extremely difficult in the context of militant groups, in which creating mechanisms for verification and auditing also means creating mechanisms for the security system and the security services to understand your own internal structures and to understand how to disrupt operation of the organization. And so, in the very extreme case, you have cases in which, so for example, the principal would like to give money to an agent for operations, and the agent would like to take that money and go to the beach for a week, and would like to then report back up of, oh, well, I tried to carry out the attack you asked for, oops, but I got interrupted, don't notice my tan kind of thing. Which is a very flippant way of describing this, but there is actually a lot of work looking at how, in fact, as you go into looking at logisticians in militant groups, they tend to live for much longer than operatives, and they also tend to live maybe a little bit outside of the resources that you might expect them to have at their disposal. So there's a very distinctive principal-agent dilemma within militant groups, even inside the militant groups, even before thinking about going outside of the militant groups. And so therefore, I think that in looking at principals and agent and bringing that perspective into these contracts and compensation structure, we can start looking at variation in how contracts of agreements are designed and how compensation is then provided to the agents in order to encourage the agents to act in ways that the principal would prefer. And so the two salient divisions I'm looking at are relational versus transactional contracts and ongoing versus speculative compensation. So relational contracts is an economics term for unwritten, based on shared norms and expectations. These are agreements that you often find in very complex situations in which the activities that would be expected to be carried out by the agent are very amorphous, in which you cannot explicitly say what precise component of what precise component look like of success. And so therefore the contracts are carried out successfully by shared norms. And they're enforced by what's called the shadow of the future. And they're enforced by if you shirk and you don't produce what is expected, then you just won't work together in the future. So to make this very abstract conversation a little more specific, what this might look like in the context of a militant group is different brigades allying together in order to carry out a joint attack against a government military base. In this case, the government military base is an offensive and it's a target, and the groups agree that they will work together for it. And they cannot possibly list every single possible contingency of the conflict or of the offensive. So they'll just generally agree that they will support each other. And that's understood to mean that you won't, break your weapons in the conflict. You will carry out a good faith effort to protect the lives of the other soldiers. You won't bail as soon as things start looking dicey. In contrast to a relational contract, transactional contracts are ones in which it is much easier to enumerate what is expected from each different party. And so in a militant context, that might look like a IED workshop who is contracted to provide a car bomb. All of the different pieces of this are expected, and they don't sort of generally say, give me something that works. You say, I want a car bomb of this model or this design. And then on the other side of this agreements is the question of how is compensation? Is it ongoing or speculative? So ongoing would be remuneration that's not based on a successful outcome. It's salaries, it's maintenance. In this case, or the case of the IED workshop, it would be, the person is being compensated for producing the explosives and not only after a successful carrying out of the attack with the car that is being provided. Whereas speculative is a little more open-ended. It's remuneration only after success. So for the relational example that I just gave of brigades allying together in order to carry out a joint offensive on a government base or supply depot, it may be the case that or is often the case in things I've seen, especially in Syria, in which the agreement is that you will jointly fight together, and then after seizing the supply depot, they'll divvy out weapons and ammunition that's seized. And that means that everyone who participates in this conflict and this is offensive is only rewarded after they've successfully captured the supply depot. No depot, no spoils, no compensation. And so what can we think about what each of these four combinations of the different axes can look like? So in the ongoing and relational, I'm calling the staffer quadrant. Those are people that are given some kind of ongoing maintenance. They're compensated in ways that aren't only specific to success, and they have these very wide, long future interactions. Those are members of groups. When, however, you have this and it's speculatively compensated, that looks more like a freelance brigade. Those are the independent brigades from the Syria quotes, in which they have very open-ended interactions that are based on mutual trust and agreement, but there isn't an ongoing sort of support or financial relationship with the group that they conduct operations with. On the other side, a transactional contract type with a sort of a non-speculative compensation platform might look like contractors, where they're taken, they're contracted for a very specific operation, for something concrete, but they're not only compensated if that concrete thing acts in the way in which the principal expects it to. Whereas the sort of much more speculative and transactional side would be contingents. That's your bounty hunters, in which they have no ongoing relationship, they're transactionally contracted, and are only compensated upon a successful operation. So to put examples into these quadrants that are sort of still very abstract, the Islamic State is one extreme example of a staffer organization. They tried to make a semi-state militant group, like actually an authoritarian state, with ongoing salaries as they were able to pay for them, with training camps, with indoctrination, people live together. And this is a context in which the Islamic State expected that in return for their salaries and training, they would have monopoly over the time of all of their employees, all of their fighters. These independent brigades are the speculative side. They have sort of open-ended relationships, but no one in the independent brigades, they may support each other as much as they can, and the brigades themselves may be tightly internally structured, but their relationship with their principal is not one of ongoing maintenance. You come together when you need to, and then you go your separate ways. The contractors, where you see these categories showing up a lot, is in independent trainers. There are several of them in Syria that are sort of generally supporting the Sunni resistance, and they do advanced military training for people that are in the same kind of ideological space, but there isn't necessarily this long interaction back and forth that you would find in a relational contract, and it's a very specific thing that they're producing. They're producing, X number of day commando training camps. You saw this as well in Afghanistan in the 1980s, where there were Afghan Arabs that would have specific training camps that were localized to the Sunni insurgency and the Afghan Arab connection. But you'd go to them for a course or an explosive training. And then the explosive workshops that caused so much trouble in Iraq and Afghanistan would be similarly in this bucket. And finally, the contingents are bounty hunters. They're the ad hoc emplacers. They're the ones that the NATO analysts were describing as being so incredibly difficult to oppose, because they're people that are coming together at the point of being contracted and then at the point of being paid, but they don't have any long-term relationship to the principal. And what that also means is that you can round up as many of these bounty hunters as you can find, and that will only make the smallest dent in the operations of the principal, because the contingent operative doesn't really have much relationship. They only have the relationship with the logistician. So why would you want to do these various things, right? So this is a wide range of different kinds of options of employment, and each of which has specific benefits and drawbacks. So the first is that staffers they have control, they have predictability. The organization has the expectation of control of and monopoly on all of the sort of violent and even non-violent actions of the people that are within the group. This is, being a militant employee of an organization. The drawback is that it is very, very expensive. Again, as anyone who does management or has employees knows, there's salaries, there's fringe, there's maintenance. It requires a lot of management, which again goes back to this question of security versus control. Management is stuff that your opponent's signals intelligence can use as a lever to understand how an organization works. And it requires a lot of institutional design, which sometimes is a little more difficult and more subtle than you might necessarily think at the outset. How do these institutions design and become ossified? How do you create separate propaganda networks, et cetera? So this is a very big undertaking to have staffers. So for freelancers, there's a lot of benefits. One of the major benefits is that they're extremely flexible. You can have the core staff that you maintain that is sort of at your financial capability or at your managerial capability, and then you can add on almost in a modular way. You can bring in other different brigades, and you can put together different types of portfolios of skills and resources for different operations. So for example, there's one that I saw from early in the Syrian conflict of actually complaints about mismanagement, of some Chechen militants complaining that their commander wasn't very good because they wanted to carry out an operation against a Syrian state base. And they needed some tanks. And this Chechen group didn't have tanks. But there was another brigade that did. And the other brigade offered to join this group and bring their tanks for that particular offensive against a very fortified Syrian base in exchange for, first cut at the loot. And at the time, the commander that the Chechens were complaining about said no, because he didn't want to break up the loot. But this is a story that really illustrates how you can build different skills and capabilities for operations without having to maintain it internally. And so you can do that, and because of this modularity, you can very quickly respond to pressure, to changes in the conflict setting. The problem is that flexibility is also volatility. And this is one of the things that we're seeing, I think, in the past couple of years in Syria as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is trying to consolidate, is that it's extremely hard to know who's available, who is around, what can be brought to bear for a conflict, and who is maybe outbidding you for the activities and skills of the potential fighters. It seems to be conducive to conflicts with a lot of unstable, squabbling small groups, which means that you really can't win. So this is where you get a lot of that discussion that was, if you remember from the slides of militants, about squabbling and infighting. So contractors is another approach. And contractors is the third quadrant. And it is really beneficial for access to difficult skills without R&D, without research and development. It increases the overall skill level of the conflict. And so one of the things that made it so incredibly dangerous for the US and their allies in Iraq and Afghanistan is that as soon as any IED workshop developed better IEDs, everyone on the Sunni side who could afford it had access to those explosives. And this makes it very dangerous. It scales up very quickly. A drawback, though, is that if that workshop is discovered, it can quickly knock out the skills and capabilities of a lot of different people in the organization. A lot of different organizations in the conflict, because it's all centralized in one location. And finally, the contingents. Benefits being that they are extremely flexible. They have no maintenance requirements, because you basically just set out word that you're willing to pay X amount of money for Y kind of operation, and wait to see what has shown up. But it's really, and it gives the impression of a much larger organization with a much larger amount of capabilities and control, right? So if you can send out information that you're willing to pay for certain kinds of actions, and you have a sort of general interest in having it in a certain geographic area, you can give the impression that you, as a principal with your organization, are active in that zone, when in fact you may not be. You may be on a messaging app transferring money around for operations, but you don't actually have any control on the ground. The drawback is that it's difficult to incentivize complex operations. It's difficult at all to have anything that's very complex. And principals seem to have less control over the details of their targets. In this case, by announcing bounties, you don't, it seems to be the case from my reading of primary sources reporting that you might have a bounty on a specific person as a principal, but much more likely the principal may have a category of targets that they're willing to compensate operatives for attacks against. And so then what ends up is very vulnerable to happening is that the principal ends up paying agents to carry out operations that help the agents with their own local political issues. And so that can be a way in which the direction of the conflict becomes very quickly shift out from the principal's preferred direction. So what are some ways in which these different kind of ways of doing informal insurgent human resources can be put together? As I've been mentioning, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria a lot for the past 35 minutes. And so in Afghanistan, you have these staffer, freelancer, and contingents all combined together. The Sunni insurgency in Iraq has all of these dimensions, but the ones that are really very salient are especially the contractor and contingent dimensions. These would be, as I said, the IED workshops. And in the Syrian civil war, it seems to very much be the freelancer is very dominant, and versus the staffer model. So in the Afghanistan case, this Khaldun camp in the 80s became a central independent training for Afghan Arabs, which were Arab volunteers that came to fight the Soviet Union as a sort of jihadi mission. But one of the really interesting things that really highlights what the contractors can do is that it then trained a lot of militants who returned to their home countries and exported a certain way of thinking about militant structure around the Arab world. More currently, you have the current Afghan Taliban structure, in which the Afghan Taliban has an extremely interesting structure, and there's some really good books about it that I can recommend in the Q&A if people are interested. But they have done a lot of subcontracting to local operations and created what are called sweeteners or bounties for specific targets. And that's one way in which the Afghan Taliban apparently goes into new locations and destabilizes it for their staffer militants to come in. One way in which we can touch back to activities of the previous year is that you may remember in early summer of 2000, there was what could have been a major scandal that broke in the news of reports that Russia was paying the Afghan Taliban bounties for US troops. And this became sort of a multifaceted scandal, in part because the question of, how long did President Trump know about this? Was he briefed on it? Was President Trump continuing peace negotiations with the Afghan Taliban that were actively trying to carry out bounties on the American soldiers? And whether the cash was coming from Russia. And so this is a political scandal in the U.S. that has a lot of facets and a lot of ways in which it can be, extremely politically salient. But one of the things that was also very interesting about this is at the time the Afghan Taliban was vociferously claiming that peace talks should continue because they were not in fact part of this bounty structure. And it seems to be the case that if there's probably a lot that we don't know, but what seems to be the case is that these bounties were contingent bounties, is that middlemen would arrange for bounties on certain kinds of operations that were by people who may or may not have been Afghan Taliban aligned. They may have just been freelancers that were operating under the kind of strategic direction of the Taliban, financed by Russian money. So this is one way in which this particular kind of aspect of the gig economy insurgency really pulls up into some very interesting geopolitical confluences of scandals. And then in Iraq, how this plays out is looking at, sort of an analysis of that then looks at the direction of U.S. counterinsurgency efforts and how effective it has been by looking at the going rate of contingent operations. So there's actually an entire theme of analysis that you can find that's looking at the rate of IED and rocket attacks, where at the beginning of the insurgency, when the U.S. is not doing very well, it's extremely cheap to hire rocket-propelled grenades, IEDs, sniper videos. And then as sort of the U.S. surges and as they get their footing under them in counterinsurgency, the price of these operations goes up because they become more risky to the agents carrying them out. And then in Syria, the avenue in which the different kind of gig economy insurgency plays out has a lot of influence on the Sunni insurgency that is against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And part of it is this volatility, is that because so much of the conflict is carried out by freelancers, it's extremely hard for principals to maintain stable coalitions of fighters. And one of the things that you can pick up in this quote, which I've actually pulled the headline of for the article in case anyone's interested, because it's really interesting and quite tragic to read, is that this Agath Abal-Had is an Iraqi reporter, and he's retelling a scene of what are effectively a freelance brigade leaving an ad hoc alliance. And the principal who's trying to hold the alliance together is frankly desperately begging the people not to leave. And what happens, though, is that the principal is trying to maintain strategic control over the hills of Aleppo, but there's not loot. And because the insurgency is so reliant on freelancers put together with the promise of loot, they cannot hold strategically important but quite resource-poor locations. And so these previous three slides have been examples of how sort of what might seem like a very academic kind of abstract difference in ways of human resources of insurgency can have really major impacts on the conflict of the battle, as well as on the political situation of actors. So to wrap up and think in a bigger picture, what are the benefits of undergoing these kinds of gig economy insurgency? One of which is you have reduced exposure to risks of capture. And I think the thing that's extremely useful here, and that makes it almost impossible to not go into if you can, is that you can shrink the size of the core group. The principal can keep a smaller, more well-trained organization. They don't have to pay as much in terms of maintenance and salary, which should all sound quite familiar from a lot of the larger social discussion of the gig economy, while at the same time, using the skills of people who are available for ad hoc operations. Requires less infrastructure and logistics, and can quickly increase the area of operation and thereby give the group opportunity to expand if they want to, or the impression of being a really major player. Militants themselves find that there are many benefits and drawbacks. One of the really interesting quotes from this Abu Fulan al-Muhajir that I quoted earlier in the presentation is that at the time of the major fratricidal infighting in Syria between ISIS and the al-Qaeda-aligned Nusra group and the later Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the kind of more al-Qaeda but also more locally Syrian Sunni opposition jihadi group, many fighters didn't want any part of this fratricidal conflict. They were there to fight the regime, the Syrian regime. And so they found that by being part of independent groups, they could opt out of this strategic battle. So they could select campaigns of interest. You could have more control over your time, effort, and targets. So this is one thing that has made it very appealing for militants to sign up for being part of groups outside of a staffer model. But this creates a lot of downstream second and third order implications. The first is that the conflict become much more complex. End games and settlements are more complicated. There's a really interesting vignette about how this long-lasting effect of the sophisticated IED workshops in Iraq during the time of the U.S. Occupation in the early 2000s, shows up in problems even now on the Iraqi-Sunni border, or Iraqi-Syria border. Because one of the things that these centralized IED workshops did is that they very quickly elevated the level of sophistication of explosives in the conflict. And they created a genre, a very, very widespread availability of explosives that were very sophisticated and very difficult to take apart. And that the flood of these explosives are now found on the Iraqi-Syrian border, often put there by ISIS, as ISIS was trying to make it more difficult to for the coalition to remove ISIS from operations. And so even 15 years later, these workshops and the sort of technological centralization that they created is still playing out in the region. It's also more difficult because a lot of conflict endgames look at groups and the group members. But how do you think about a much larger infrastructure of freelancers and militants and contingent fighters? One of the things that will sort of bridge into potential larger implications is that there are, principals start losing control of conflict trajectories. The more they delegate to agents and the more hands-off they are, the more they're susceptible to the interests of the agents taking over the direction of the conflict. And so much of these interactions are based on trust, especially for those agents that are speculatively compensated. They have to fundamentally believe that they will be compensated after success, or it's just absolutely not worth becoming involved in the conflict. And so what this does is it increases the importance of shortcuts to building trust. And one of the things that is a very effective shortcut to building trust is a shared extremist ideology. And so there's a story that I could tell you about the way that Syrian conflict goes from the Free Syrian Army to the jihadi militants, that says that because of the volatility of the freelancers, having money and a shared sense of trust among more jihadi-oriented and more extremist-oriented militants allow them to take domination over the Sunni insurgency against Bashar al-Assad. And I think that as we think about potential more general takeaways, to me that is one of the really striking implications of the direction of this gig economy conflict. And so in a very high level takeaway, you can remember, if you think of a couple of things, is that sometimes militant groups are vertically integrated. We didn't talk about it now, but the IRA is notoriously vertically integrated. ISIS, very vertically integrated. But many, many more have been pioneers of gig economy, of sort of informal economic arrangements. And this was evident years before the concept of the gig economy started taking over all of our newspaper articles and think pieces. And I think that this does have a lot to tell us about broader trends, is that when you make coalitions of ideologically similar freelancers, you can extend capability. And because of the importance of a shared ideology and often how much extremism creates shared sense of trust, this can very easily get taken over by more extreme perspectives in a conflict ecosystem that have a very specific way of looking at the world. And I think that as well, there's a sort of interesting cautionary note about short-term economies of scale, but long-term loss of trajectory. that it may be something that we see play out in other contexts as well. And with that, I will leave you, and I look forward to questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Foster. I know one of the things that's frustrating is you can't hear the applause, but we can. We're imagining the applause right now. I think it was a really, really thorough look at this. Very, very interesting perspective on what I think a lot of people don't appreciate is the complexity of what we're facing in the Middle East. I want to remind everyone that we have questions. Please use the question and answer button at the bottom to give questions to our presenter. But we have a few to start with. One of the things that's curious, and it has something to do, you mentioned loss of trajectory. And I'm just wondering that, that many of these groups, and you mentioned, of course, the shared ideology as well. Many of these groups are speaking, at least ideologically, in the name of all. In the case of these particular extremist groups, again, I understand this can be in different types, but in the name of these particular extremist groups in the Middle East, in the name of all Muslims, is there any effect of having this sort of not vertically aligned, having this all of these different groups? Does that have any effect on the sense of solidarity in this group, sort of the overall ideological vision that you can have competition? It seems more sometimes transactional. Does it have any ideological effect to go with this more gig economy approach?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think that there's a couple of different ways that you can think about approaching it, or at least that I can think about approaching it. The first is to look at the degree to which fighting against an occupier is an extremely effective way of unifying lots of different gig economy modules together. So this is something you see in both the Afghanistan in the 80s and the Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s, is that maybe people who would not want to be fighting alongside ideological extremists but are interested in doing that because they're fighting against sort of a nationalist anti-occupation perspective. So that brings in more skills. And that's particularly effective in the contractor quadrant, where the skills to be a really sophisticated bomb maker, say, is not necessarily easy to come by. And so by widening the pool as much as possible, you have more potential people to draw from to create these hubs. Another slightly different way to think about this is to look at the fratricidal conflict between the Nusra Front and ISIS in Syria, Nusra Front Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And again, these are both on the Sunni jihadi side. So we're talking about a relatively small cross-section of the Sunni insurgency. So we're not talking necessarily about the secular opposition. We're talking they should be very ideologically similar. But as the two groups physically fought for being dominant in the Sunni jihadi insurgency in Syria, there was a lot of conflict internally from people who were discussing their experiences fighting for these groups, and a lot of discontent about not wanting to fight fellow Muslims. So that's a place where this sort of shared maximalist ideology actually really reduced the principal's ability to demand certain kinds of operations. And I think that that's one of the things that increased the salience of independent brigades in Syria even after the first wave of the conflict. Is that you have the first wave of the conflict where there's a lot of independent brigades, and then they tended to consolidate into larger ideologically coherent groups. But then because of this fratricidal infighting, I think there was more going back into a sense of independent brigades as fighters wanted to opt out of fighting someone that their sort of shared ideology said should not be an enemy.
Great, thank you for that. I have a question here from Tom and Miriam Zitlow. They were asking, do you see the same type of HR behavior with drug cartels or other militant actions in South and Central America?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I will admit that this is less my area of expertise, but there is a lot of work on drug cartel HR. And I think that this is one of the areas in which there's more emphasis on reducing exit. And so a really canonical bit of economics there is asking, why do cartel members have a lot of very distinctive tattoos? And one bit of hypothesis is that it's to keep people in the staffer quadrant, is to reduce the outside options of the people who are within an organization, and so to make them a little bit cheaper to maintain. I know less about the sort of more up-to-date HR, and so I'll stop speculating, actually, because I would.
I mean, it reminds me, we hear this expression, drug mules, always, the way they're always, I mean, again, I'm just making references to maybe TV that I've seen where this notion of the drug mule usually is an outsider, right? Someone that's not going to be identified who can take the drugs, and that might be an example of this sort of gig economy.
Yeah, my intuition would be that it is, my intuition would be that it is actually one of the things that has been really notable by people working on HR of drug groups is the degree to which they become vertically integrated. And that is apparently one of the ways in which cartels have gotten extremely powerful in the past couple of years. So it's actually, that would suggest it's going the opposite direction of this. But again, this is an area where I would want to brush up a little more before I confidently stare at the camera and tell you things that are wrong.
And a clearly speculative observation would be that you would wonder if these groups are looking at each other and the way that they're like in completely ideological frameworks, looking at each other and saying, well, that's a really very successful organization. It seems to be more vertically integrated. So it'd be interesting, that study of how they look at each other and find ideas.
I think the question is money, though, right? Like if you're vertically integrated as a drug cartel, you don't lose money to cuts at every point along the way.
Great. I have a question from Brian Keeloff. He asks, if you were in charge of strategy, what would you do to combat these insurgents and terrorists based on the knowledge of this particular way in which they organize their actions?
So I think that there's a couple of things I would do. So in the case of a contractor, I think really focusing on figuring out what is the unique portion of the network. So for IEDs, right, it's the person who's constructing it. That's a really rare bit of knowledge, and it sort of becomes scale free. It escalates quickly throughout the entire conflict. I think that one of the things that is a little bit cynical is to look at the degree to which conflict internally over preferred targets seems to be extremely difficult to manage in a context of a lot of independent brigades. And so if I was combating organizations like this, I might really try to encourage independent brigades and then see if there's some kind of leverage you can use to create internal fraction. And part of my take on this is that the drumbeat of we need to unify is so consistent in the jihadi sphere that the fact that they can't get there means that it's a huge bit of organizational slack and difficulty.
Very interesting. It reminds me that this is a question that our colleague here, Paul Bonici, asked, and it certainly seems like one of the techniques to combat this would be to find a way to influence those actors to find some sort of incentive to not be aligned with this extreme ideology. On the other side, Paul asked, can you talk about the U.S.'s use of gig workers in this conflict? Is that the way the United States is using contractors or other ways that this is sort of a gig economy on the other side?
Yeah, so I mean that is especially has been the case in the Iraq War, is that there was just this proliferation of contractors, of semi-independent military groups. In the U.S. context, one of the things that's become really difficult is that there's very little oversight, and so that is something that the U.S. has done very aggressively, and I think has had a lot of consequences in terms of giving organizations that are opposed to the U.S. really excellent sound bites, but they can then link to the U.S. through these gig contractors that are outside of U.S. kind of chains of accountability. I think that's been extremely detrimental for American efforts to project a sense of consistent ethical standpoints.
Certainly the Blackwater situation would be a glaring example of that, with the situation that was recently pardoned. Tom and Miriam ask another question. Also, similar HR approaches. There are also similar HR approaches in the U.S. radical right and left organizations, Oath Keepers, Antifa, etc. So
I don't know as much about Antifa. I know that for years the far left has done a lot of cross-training. I know that the far right is very cognizant, or some areas of the far right have been very cognizant of themselves as being part of a networked, transnational network of especially neo-Nazi and neo-fascist organizations that very actively seek training from each other. I would be extremely unsurprised if, as these militant groups continue to develop, you don't start seeing, and actually really we already have started seeing a lot of coalescing around contractors, especially around shared, sort of ideologically similar, but not internal to any specific group training facilities. So there's, so for example, several Ukrainian far-right groups do a lot of training. You can go on tours of Europe, from fight clubs to attain training.
Great, thank you for that. This Jerry Everhart's asking a question. We sort of touched on it a little bit when we talked about drug cartels, but I guess I would just ask for other examples. He's asking about other conflicts outside the Middle East, the Shining Path in Colombia, the IRA in Northern Ireland. I guess I would just add this. I'm going to expand Jerry's question, if I have his permission, to just say, can you give us other examples around the world where this gig economy has been attached to, if not necessarily militancy, but extremism or other ways of organizing that are protesting against governments or a particular situation?
Yeah, so I know, for example, Thai separatists were doing a lot of subcontracting of specific violence to, what was called like local hoodlums or something. You again pay for certain shooting operations. One of the things that was a little bit tricky in putting this together is that once you package this as the gig economy insurgency, it all seems very obvious, but it was a little bit tricky to tease out discussions of these kind of behaviors. And so some of the ways in which I looked at it were very specific to how journalists especially write about jihadism. But I think that one of the things that happens is really when you have a large protest, when you have militant groups that are trying to expand their base. We see this a lot in protest movements where you send out a message to lots of different sort of small organizations that have a very specific perspective. And say, come together for an ad hoc coalition. My email gets full of like the Audubon Society and like the Durham Greenways and the Durham Bike Group that wants us to come together for some like letter writing campaign. And you could sort of very, very, very abstract what I'm talking about and think of this as being a little bit equivalent to those freelancers. You have lots of different groups that have like their own kind of centers of membership. That have some shared thread in what they're interested in advocating for, that come together for ad hoc campaigns. But which, for those at home, to be clear, I'm not saying that like the Audubon Society is in any way similar to jihadi militants.
I think we can understand that, although certainly we want to protect birds. Brian Keeleff asks again, you are going to return to 9/11 if asked. And I think you're being asked. Please do.
So thank you for picking up that thread. One of the things that was, I think, turned out to be something that you can get in memoirs of being active in the Afghan Arab community in the 1980s. So these are Arab fighters who go to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. And this covers a wide range of sort of jihadi revolutionaries who get kicked out of their home countries. This would be the Egyptian revolutionaries. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current leader of Al-Qaeda, being one of these members. Algerian revolutionaries. Over to teenagers for whom this is like a summer kind of camp thing, where it's you go fight and come back and you talk about your summer fighting the Soviets. One of the things that can come out of memoirs from this time period is the degree to which there were lots of different pockets of people's leadership and people's organizations and centers of command and money that were not always as aligned as our later threads looking at 9/11 or looking at the emergence of Al-Qaeda after 9/11 started. So for example, bin Laden in the sort of late 80s, early 90s tried to build Al-Qaeda from his vision. And he wanted to absorb a lot of other organizations. And so there's this great vignette in The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright, where bin Laden goes to Ayman al-Zawahiri and tries to incorporate his Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And Zawahiri says no. And then bin Laden courts him again and gets rebuffed. And then somewhere along the line, an apartment in Cairo is raided that has a laptop or a computer at that point with a spreadsheet that has the Egyptian Islamic Jihad's entire membership base, phone numbers, known locations of hanging out, nicknames, family members. And at this point, Zawahiri joins bin Laden because he just cannot continue on in his own. But as part of that, there's a discussion in The Afghan Arabs at War, which is this really great memoir by Leah Farrell and Mohammed Hamid. Not Mohammed Hamid, Hamid. Hamid and Farrell. And Hamid is a very high-level member of Al-Qaeda, like just below the number of people that you would recognize their name of. And he's talking about how a lot of the groups are very independent. And a lot of the training camps are actually independent contractor training camps. And specifically, the Khaldoun training camp is explicitly an independent training camp that in the analysis after 9/11 gets heavily linked to Al-Qaeda. And then going through Khaldoun becomes an identifier of being a member of Al-Qaeda. But at the time, it was actually an explicitly jihadi but group agnostic training camp that became important because they would take people that were not officially affiliated with one group or the other. And so then this creates this perception of a much wider net of Al-Qaeda membership than actually existed that sort of at the contemporaneous time. And then Khaldoun was also doing experiments with things like biological warfare that then gets pulled into expectation of what Al-Qaeda itself was doing. But it became a shorthand for like a much more complex, patchy network of camps.
We like to make the things we're scared of seem much more together and organized and unified like that in a way when in fact they're putting it all together in pieces as well.
Right, they're figuring out as they go along too. But that book is really phenomenal if you have an interest in that time period.
Well, we put links to everything. When you mention a book, we put a link into it. So I want to just ask you a question about labor. One of the things that it's sort of the way you've described this, it always seems like equals, that we have equals entering into contracts for ideological similar reasons, and then they have disagreements as equals. But certainly when we think about gig economy, we tend to think about sort of the abuse of workers. And I'm thinking about, is there the potential for abuse in this situation? And is there any, this sounds odd, is there any labor movement within this gig economy?
Yeah, so one of the ones is the tracking of the increasing prices of labor in Iraq for emplacing, right? Is that the job market for young men is so bad that this is an option, and at the beginning it's an easy option, relatively easy, so it's pretty cheap, and then as it becomes more dangerous, the prices have to start increasing, and so that's not quite the same as unionizing, but it is reflecting varying willingness to participate based on the difficulty of the context or expected blowback.
Very interesting. Well, I had a question from Lloyd Kramer. And Dr. Lloyd Kramer, our fearless director of Carolina Public Humanities, hello Lloyd, was asking, was there an equivalent to the gig economy communications in early eras of political upheavals, such as the Atlantic revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries? Are there long-term continuities in radical or transnational political mobilizations?
So those of you who are historians, I'm sure, can hopefully tell me when I'm being incorrect. But I believe that a lot of Washington's diaries are about his difficulty in organizing militias together and in trying to build coalitions for his revolutionary army by giving concessions to small militias that have their own perspectives. So I wonder if that can be, you can trace this gig economy through that, and this general narrative of building sort of revolutionary movements by creating ad hoc coalitions. And then one of the things that I think you can, if you were going to look for this in a sort of a deeper historical trajectory, is one of the things that's been sort of an interesting subtext is that when you're building coalitions by people that have specific ideologies, the leader often has to kind of give a little bit of concession to that ideology. But often one of the ways in which these groups become clustered together is by a shared territoriality, right? And so you end up with like the sort of the English Revolution having a really hard time moving into Scotland. Or I think the Revolutionary War Army had a really hard time in some of their movement because you can build together sort of independent fighters in one zone that are just not interested in leaving their own homesteads.
Certainly we always think of the militias as the Minutemen and whatnot as this great collective thing, but you read much more about sort of worker complaints, and I'm not going there and walking away and causing great distress to Washington's army, certainly.
Right, and so there's that kind of negotiating of having to put together these volatile ad hoc coalitions of independent
Well, that's fascinating. Well, we don't have any questions right now, but I have a question for you, and Paul has a question, I think. But I have one question for you. Why don't we go with Paul's question first? What is it, Paul?
Well, I'm just wondering, are there any apps that link like militants together with particular groups like Uber or, I mean, obviously not that easy, but how do these groups find each other? Like, how do the bomb makers find the different like
WhatsApp,
groups working
Telegram.
for? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm now sufficiently old to say when I first started doing this. So for a while it was dark web networks. You could go find forums. Then I believe WhatsApp has become a really big deal. Telegram, even sort of like messaging applications. It's a little more complicated when you're operating against like a state like the U.S. that has like ginormous SIGINT capabilities. But at a certain point, there's also so much noise that it's really hard to look at how the coordination happens. And so actually that's one of the, it's sort of an interesting, has bigger implications, right? Is that as it is easier to scale up communications, then it becomes much easier to pull together, string together gig economy workers. And just as the non-militant context can do this too, it's also easier to do this at scale in a militant context. And so those of you who are asking about non-militants or far right or in sort of an other context behind the jihadi context, the apps are all there for it. Social media and networks are all there for it.
Well, that's great. Brian Keeliff has another question for you. Of these people involved, how many are ideological zealots and how many are doing this for economic reasons? If more of the latter, any way to take care of their financial interests without having to resort to killing people?
So especially in the contingents, right? Like a lot of them, if they're doing it for funds, there's some quotes that I don't have here, but basically, this is the job market in these contexts. And that one of the ways in which the U.S. was very successful initially at trying to draw down some of these sort of contingent fighters is by very explicitly building public works and trying to hire a lot of young men who might be emplacing IEDs. The problem is that especially when you're an occupier, I think they found that was very successful writ large. The problem, the essential problem of counterinsurgency is that you only need a few mistakes for the whole thing to be unsuccessful. And so writ large, this was successful, and it reduced the sort of tempo of IED attacks laid by individual fighters, or sort of contingent agents. But at the very, very micro level, you would have people who would like go work on a big public work by day, and then hey, why not have an extra $50 at night to like put a bomb down? And I think that sort of speaks to the bigger question of how extremely difficult it is to carry out an occupation. Is that that's just a very sort of different philosophical question. But so I think that there's a relatively strong case to be made that at the level of the contingents especially, it's probably the case that sort of like large public work campaigns can deter a lot of these actions. But if the target of the violence is generally accepted as being a legitimate target, it may not be sufficient.
Very interesting. Well, we don't have any more questions, but I have one question for you. What is the next step for your research? What is next for this project and looking deeper into this? Or what are you interested in finding out more about related to this, if not necessarily continue with this very project?
So I'm always, my general interest is in how short-term decisions have long-term consequences that principals are not necessarily interested in. So my sort of big dissertation project that I'm working on now is how when you bring in recruiting from new demographics that can fundamentally change the course of an insurgency or an organization without being what the principal wanted, as they kind of have to accommodate and go off in different directions. So this kind of picked up a lot in the bigger picture stuff that I was talking about, of how you can have these groups that by having made these short-term decisions to go into the gig economy, now find themselves sort of desperately trying to stay ahead of it without being able to make deeper inroads into their ultimate strategic goal. I would quite like to expand this out to a book. I think that, as a lot of the questions said, right, like I've pulled out this framework in the context of the transnational jihadi community. frankly, because that's the one that I've got a lot of data about. And so I can spend a summer going through and synthesizing a lot of the threads and trying to make them into something that is coherent and sort of internally, internally sort of intellectually and consistent. But I think that this is not a new or like an isolated effect. I think, yeah. So those are sort of the two.
Well, it's certainly the idea of short-term decisions having long-term consequences. I think every parent in the world understands that. Well, one more time, I want to put your hands together, and I'm just going to come up and say a few things to say goodbye, but we'll bring you back to say a final goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. And folks, thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Margaret Foss for that fantastic talk again. Keeping in mind that we have another talk coming up next week with Ashley Anderson looking at popularism and the threat to democracy, certainly something we're very aware of from recent news. I also want to remind folks of our Adventure in Ideas seminar coming up at the end of the month on what we can learn from animals, perhaps a little bit of a lighter topic, but animals can be serious too. And of course, our Atom Symposium coming up on April 16th and 17th with Dr. Liz Anderson, philosopher from the University of Michigan. All of these programs are wonderful. There are public-facing programs, but again, I want to remind you folks that we have a very extensive outreach to other communities, and these are an outreach efforts that require no funds for those that participate in them and are of great benefit. And we also want to bring your attention to the fact that we could use all the help, and right now the university could use all the help it can get as we face a severe financial crisis, both for the whole university, but for everybody. So this is we're coming up on Give UNC, which is a great initiative. Paul is dropping some links in there so you'll understand what this is, a university-wide initiative. And Carolina Public Humanities is also involved in this, and we have one announcement to make, a very important one. If you are interested in giving to Carolina Public Humanities as part of the Give UNC campaign, we have an angel donor who will be matching all gifts up to $25,000. So any gift you give, again, once we hit the max of $25,000 by all collected gifts, we have a match for that. So this is a great opportunity to double the impact of any giving you want to give to Carolina Public Humanities and help us in our important mission. Remember, all donations are tax deductible, and donations of any size are greatly appreciated, especially because they'll be twice what you give us today. So thank you for thinking about that. And one more time, I'm going to bring Margaret Foster back up here. Please go to humanities.unc.edu. Margaret, come on up and say goodbye to our crowd.
Thank you very much for your attention and for your really fantastic questions. It's been a delight to be here, and I really appreciate your feedback and engagement.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you next time. Come next week. Go to humanities.unc.edu. Follow us on Facebook. Follow us on YouTube, and we'll see you next week.